Dr. Bart Ehrman has often claimed that Jesus himself never said that he is God in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He said this in his debate with Peter S. Williams, or Peter J. Williams, the New Testament scholar. However, when we look at the Old Testament and look at the claims Jesus makes in the Synoptic Gospels, we find that this is of certainty not the truth. For example, in the book How God Became Jesus by Michael Bird and other scholars, they cite Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 7 to 16. Here is what Dr. Michael Bird says. According to Ezekiel, Yahweh stands against the false shepherds, and he is coming to regather and to shepherd his people. Furthermore, Ezekiel talks about Yahweh himself bringing back the lost sheep of Israel, and that he will judge between the sheep and the goats. Ezekiel 34, verses 16 to 17. As we shall see, these are the exact claims Jesus himself makes in the Synoptic Gospels. For example, in Luke chapter 15, verses 4 to 7, and Matthew 18, 10 to 14, they include parallels of the parable of the lost sheep. However, this is not present in Mark's Gospel, which means that this material is found in the early source called Q, material shared by Matthew and Luke, but independent of Mark. Furthermore, Jesus claims to seek and to save the lost. Luke 19:10, and in some manuscripts of Matthew 18:11. This can be found in Luke Wayne's Was Matthew 18:11 removed from modern Bibles? On the Christian Apologetics and Research Ministry. And I will give you the link to that in the description box. But these are claims only Yahweh can truly make to save the lost sheep of Israel. Here's what Yahweh says in Ezekiel 34:16. I will search for the lost and bring back the strayed. I will bind up the injured and strengthen the weak. But the sleek and the strong I will destroy. I will shepherd the flock with justice. Third, Jesus claims to be here to save the lost sheep of Israel. Matthew 10:6 and 15:24. In Ezekiel 34:11 to 13, God promises to search for his lost sheep and return them to the land of Israel. For this is what the sovereign Lord says, I myself will search for my sheep and look after them, as a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so I will look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on the day of the cloud and darkness. I will bring them out of the nations and gather them from countries, and I will bring them into their own land. I will pasture them on the mountains of Israel, in the ravines, and in all the settlements in the land. Finally, God promises to judge between the sheep and the goats. This promise reflects what is said in Matthew 25:31 to 46, in which Jesus, the Son of Man who sits on God's glorious throne, claims to gather all nations and separate the sheep from the goats. And this is not the only place where he does this in Matthew. For example, Jesus claims that at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne, You who have followed me, the 12 disciples, will judge the 12 tribes of Israel. Jesus is again claiming to judge all the nations. And this is paralleled in Luke 22:28-30. I will confer upon you a kingdom, just as the Father has conferred upon me, and you will eat and drink at my table and judge the 12 tribes of Israel. And once again, Jesus claims to judge all nations in Matthew 7:21-23. So if Jesus is claiming to judge all nations, to sit on God's throne, to gather the lost sheep of Israel, just as the God of Ezekiel claims, then this idea that Jesus never claimed to be divine is utterly ridiculous. Now let's look more deeply at all these passages. In Ezekiel 34:17 it reads, As for you, my flock, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will judge between one sheep and another, and between the rams and the goats. Let's look. It should come as no surprise then that the historical Jesus makes this same claim to this authority to Christians. It should not surprise us. In Matthew 25:31-33, Jesus sits on God's throne and judges all nations. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with them, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. A further reading of this passage confirms that Jesus indeed is claiming to be the Yahweh, the shepherd and judge of Israel, of Ezekiel 34. I mentioned some of these passages before. Let's skip down to Matthew 7:21-23. Not everyone this is what Jesus claims. Jesus claims that all the people will come before him on the day of judgment. Not everyone who says to me, to who, the Father? No, to Jesus. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only those who does the will of my Father. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? And I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. According to this passage, people will appear before Jesus as the final judge of the world, and are only indicated by the Father's will. Only vindicated by the Father's will. This again supports Trinitarian theology, because the Father and the Son are the final judge. According to the book of Joel, chapter 3, verse 12, we read that it is Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, who has authority over judgment of the world. Let the nations be roused. Let them advance into the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there I will sit to judge all the nations on every side. What about Psalm 9:7-8? Therefore, given these statements, hold on. What about Psalm chapter 9, verse 7-8? The Lord reigns forever. He has established his throne for judgment. He rules the world in righteousness and judges the people with equity. According to these passages, it is God alone who is judge over the whole world. Thus, given these statements in the Synoptic Gospels in light of these Old Testament passages, it is reasonable to believe the historical Jesus thought of himself as Yahweh, the judge of all the earth. And all of these sayings are only found in Matthew's Gospel, which many scholars will point to as evidence for an independent source for Matthew's Gospel called M, which would again put these sayings of Jesus, these exalted sayings, as independent testimony. So we have sayings in Q, like in Luke 19:10 and Matthew 18:11, where Jesus claims to save and seek the lost. And we have passages in M where Jesus claims to judge the whole world as only God does. So this claim that the historical Jesus never claims to be divine in the earlier sources is just nonsense. Now let's look at Jesus' claim to be the shepherd of the house of Israel. Here is what Ezekiel 34:11-13 says. As we read in Ezekiel 34:11-13, God himself promises to search for his sheep and look after them and return them to the land of Israel. In claiming to be the good shepherd in John 10:11-14, Jesus is claiming these attributes for himself. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I will lay my life down for my sheep. I have other sheep that are not of the sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay my life down. I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have the authority to lay it down and the authority to take it up again. This command I have received from my Father. Now, what's interesting about this is in the context of Ezekiel 34, God talks about shepherds and hired hands, such as the priests of Israel, that were in charge of keeping Israel on track or on the straight and narrow, just as John 10 talks about hired hands. For example, in Ezekiel 34:2 and verses 4-6, they show the failure of these shepherds, leaving the flock to become eaten and scattered, as John 10-12, chapter 10, verse 12 describes. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd. And they were scattered. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep wandered over all the mountains, and on every high hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. It is for this reason that God himself claims to be the one to restore Israel. in Ezekiel 34:11 to 13 and 16, and to provide them with green pastures, verses 13 to 15, and Psalm 23, 2 to 3. Moreover, because Jesus claims to be the Good Shepherd, to lay his life down for his sheep, he claims to be the God and Shepherd of Israel. In the introduction, I mentioned that the story of the lost sheep in Matthew 18, 10 to 14, Luke 15, 4 to 7, and Luke 19, 10. Recall that in Ezekiel 34, 16, Yahweh himself brought back the strays and searched for the lost. Yet in Luke 19, 10, Jesus says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." In addition, Jesus claims in Matthew 18, 12 to 14, "What do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go to look for the one that wandered off? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he is happier about the one sheep than about the 99 that did not wander off. In the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should perish." Thus, according to Jesus, both he and the Father are the God of Ezekiel 34, the God who loved us so much that he is willing to seek us out and save us. Fourth, the God of Ezekiel 34:27 claims to break the yoke of the oppressors of Israel. The trees will yield their fruit, and the ground will yield its crops. The people will be secure in their land. They will know that I am the Lord when I break the bars of their yoke and rescue them from the hands of those who enslave them. Now, Jesus parallels this, and he asks them to take our yoke upon him and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest in your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Matthew 11:29 to 30. Finally, Jesus claims to be able to give eternal life to his sheep, and that no one can snatch us out of his hands. John 10:27 to 30. / Deuteronomy 32:39. If we belong to him, we do not have to fear, because the God of the universe holds us in his hands. So in conclusion, Jesus almost certainly claims to be the God of Ezekiel 34 in the Synoptic Gospels and also in John's Gospel. So the idea that Jesus never claims to be divine is simply ridiculous. He claims to judge the whole world, Ezekiel 34:17. Matthew 25:31 to 46, etc. Jesus claims to search for God's sheep and regather Israel. Matthew 10:6, 15:24, Ezekiel 34:16, etc. And given the numerous passages where Jesus claims these attributes appear in our earliest sources, such as those shared by Matthew and Luke, and those that only Matthew possess, Q and M, it is very likely to go back to the historical Jesus. It is very likely to go back to the historical Jesus. Thus, it is undeniable that Jesus believed himself to be the God of Ezekiel 34. Thank you.